All right, so today we're going to be unpacking one of the most infamous cases in criminal history.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer. And we're going to, attempt to understand how someone can go from an outwardly ordinary life, to committing these really horrific acts.
Yeah.
And you were kind enough to share Dahmer's biography with me.
Yes.
I really think I'm interested to do this deep dive with you because I'm so fascinated by this whole nature versus nurture thing. Were there any early signs?
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that could have potentially been different?
Right.
In his life.
It's a question that's puzzled a lot of experts for decades.
Yeah.
And as we get into it, you'll see that it's really anything but straightforward.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning.
Okay.
With his childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Dahmer was born in Milwaukee to a seemingly stable middle-class family.
Yeah.
Not exactly the typical background that we would expect to see with a serial killer, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so compelling because it really does challenge some of our assumptions about serial killers coming from, broken homes or whatever.
Right.
On the surface, his early life seemed pretty typical.
Right.
Father was a chemist. His mother was a homemaker.
Yeah, but I'm guessing that things weren't as idyllic as they seemed.
Exactly. There were some underlying tensions.
Okay.
His mother, Joyce, she struggled with mental health issues.
Okay.
And that led to a lot of conflict between the parents.
Yeah.
And young Jeffrey really craved stability, but that wasn't really the reality at home.
Right. And then there's that incident when he was just 4 years old.
Yeah.
His father was, cleaning out animal remains.
Right.
And Dahmer was just completely fixated on the sound of those bones.
Yeah.
In retrospect, it seems like such a significant detail.
Yeah. Well, it could be, kind of dismissed as just childhood curiosity.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now about his future, it's hard not to see it as a possible early indicator of a fascination with death, even in animals.
Right. It's like that first crack in the foundation or something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then at age 6, he had surgery for a double hernia.
Yeah.
And his personality just seemed to shift.
Yeah.
He became much more withdrawn and quiet. Do you think that was a direct result of the surgery or?
Well, it's really hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges of, looking back at these early events and trying to analyze them.
Right.
Is this really a turning point or just a coincidence?
Yeah.
And it's a question that we'll kind of continue to explore as we go deeper.
Okay. So as he got older, he became increasingly isolated in school.
Yeah.
And, there were some behavioral red flags like faking seizures to get attention.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us can probably relate to wanting to fit in. But, his way of going about it was very unusual.
Right. And then that fascination with death continued. He started collecting roadkill.
Oh, wow.
Dissecting animals.
Yeah.
Disturbing behavior.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah.
But at this point, it's not criminal.
Right. And that brings up such an important point, though.
Yeah.
How do we distinguish between, what might just be odd or weird behavior and something that's truly dangerous, especially in, teenagers?
So one of the toughest challenges, I think, in this field.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating about this is that his father, Lionel, actually showed him how to clean and bleach animal bones.
Wow.
Thinking it was just scientific curiosity.
Gee. In hindsight, that's a pretty chilling detail.
It's like looking back at an old photograph and
Yeah.
noticing something unsettling that you totally missed the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. So during this time, he was also really struggling with his sexual identity. He, realized he was attracted to men.
Right.
And, you can imagine in the social climate of that era.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we really have to keep in mind that societal context, homosexuality was still heavily stigmatized.
Right.
It's very likely he felt, incredibly isolated and unable to confide in anyone about his feelings.
Yeah. Instead of seeking support, he turned to alcohol, which is, a common but obviously unhealthy coping mechanism.
It is.
And then to make matters worse, his parents divorced when he was 18.
Right.
His mother took his younger brother and moved away.
Yeah.
His father remarried and also moved away.
Yeah.
That left Dahmer all alone in the family home.
Yeah. It's like a perfect storm of circumstances all converging at this really pivotal moment in his development.
Yeah.
And he's dealing with a lot, questions of identity, internalized shame, and now this very profound sense of abandonment.
Yeah, it just paints a picture of a young man struggling to cope with a lot of intense emotions. And tragically, this seems like it was a major turning point for Dahmer, pushing him down this really dark path.
Yeah, because not long after this is when Jeffrey Dahmer commits his first murder. It was June of 1978. Just a few weeks after graduating high school, Dahmer was driving around Ohio when he picked up Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker.
So Hicks was just, trying to get to a concert, and Dahmer offers him a ride.
Right.
Completely unaware of the danger he's in.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just terrifying to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
Dahmer brings him back to his family's home, empty at this point, with the promise of beer and some company. They spend some time together listening to music.
It's almost unsettling how normal that sounds, which makes what happened next even more jarring.
And this is where that fear of abandonment, I think, really comes into play.
Okay.
As the evening goes on, Hicks mentions he needs to leave, and Dahmer just panics at the thought of being alone.
So was this first murder premeditated?
It doesn't seem so. It seems more like a very desperate act, driven by this impulse to kind of control the situation.
Yeah.
As Hicks is leaving, Dahmer strikes him from behind with a dumbbell.
Wow.
And then strangles him.
That's just chilling to think about that sudden escalation of violence.
It is. And what's really striking is Dahmer's reaction afterward.
Okay.
There was no remorse.
Wow.
Only this sense of satisfaction.
Really?
At having achieved this twisted sense of control. He had someone now who couldn't leave.
Right.
In the most horrific way imaginable.
So then what did he do with the body?
He takes Hicks's body down to the basement and dismembers it.
Okay.
Very methodically, almost like a gruesome scientific experiment.
Right.
He buries the remains in the woods behind the house.
And then I think a few weeks later, he dug up the remains because he was worried about them being discovered, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
He dissolves the flesh in acid.
Jeez.
Crush the bones. The level of calculation is fascinating and terrifying.
Yeah. Did he try to get help after this or talk to anybody about what he had done?
No, he buries this secret.
Wow.
And tries to move on with his life. But that first kill, it seems like it was really a point of no return.
Yeah.
He had crossed this line.
Yeah.
And the darkness within him just continued to grow.
It's like that act opened a door that he could never close again.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
It unlocked something within him.
Yeah.
He had tasted that feeling of power and control in this really twisted way. And it set the stage for what was to come.
Because he didn't kill again for almost a decade.
Right. Almost a decade.
So what happened to trigger that escalation?
So he moves to Milwaukee and tries to suppress these urges.
Okay.
But in 1987, he meets a man named Stephen Twomey at a gay bar.
Okay.
They go back to a hotel room together. Dahmer claims that he blacked out and woke up to find Twomey dead.
Okay. But he still dismembered the body. I mean, that seems like a pretty significant detail to just gloss over.
It is. And I think it's very possible there's more to that story that he's letting on. But even if this second murder was not fully intentional, it solidified a pattern.
Okay.
That act of dismemberment suggests a certain level of premeditation and a desire to cover up his actions.
It's like that first kill broke down some kind of barrier.
Right.
And now the second one is really reinforcing the path that he's on.
Exactly. From that point on, the killings escalate.
Okay.
They become more frequent, more planned.
He starts developing a modus operandi.
Yes. He would lure his victims back to his apartment with promises of money or companionship. He often preyed on young men of color, who were marginalized individuals he felt would be less likely to be missed.
Yeah, and the brutality of the crimes intensified.
Yes.
He was drugging his victims, strangling them, dismembering the bodies. He even started keeping trophies, skulls, bones.
Yeah.
What's the psychological significance behind that?
The trophies speak to, I think, this deep need for control, for possession. He claimed that they made him feel closer to his victims.
Wow.
Which is such a chilling insight into his psyche.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to just take their lives.
Right.
He wanted to keep a part of them with him.
And he even experimented with trying to create zombies by drilling holes into their skulls and injecting acid.
It's just a level of depravity that's hard to even fathom.
Yeah, and the scariest part is that he was living this totally double life.
Right.
He had a job, he interacted with neighbors.
Yeah.
maintained this facade of normalcy, no one suspected the horrors that he was committing.
And that ability to compartmentalize is actually a key characteristic of psychopathic individuals.
Okay.
They often lack empathy and remorse.
Right.
They're very skilled at manipulating others.
Yeah.
It makes their crimes even more difficult to detect because they can blend in so seamlessly.
But eventually his facade started to crumble. So how did it all finally end for Dahmer?
It all started to unravel in July of 1991.
Okay.
When one of his intended victims, a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards, managed to escape.
This is the story I think I remember most vividly because it's the one that finally exposed everything.
Right.
Edwards was actually able to flag down 2 police officers while he was still wearing handcuffs.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story of survival.
Can you imagine?
I know.
Yeah.
He tells this really harrowing tale to the police about being drugged and held captive by Dahmer.
Yeah, I can only imagine how unbelievable that must have sounded at first.
Absolutely. It sounds like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
But Edwards insists on taking the police back to Dahmer's apartment to prove that he's telling the truth.
And that's when everything comes to light.
Exactly. At first, Dahmer is very calm and cooperative. He lets the officers inside. But as they start looking around, they notice some strange smells.
Right.
And then they find the Polaroids.
Those Polaroids of Dahmer's victims in various stages of dismemberment are some of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in this case.
They're absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
And they left no doubt about the horrors that had been taking place in that apartment.
It's hard to believe that someone could document their crimes in such a calculated way.
I know.
So what was Dahmer's reaction when the police found those pictures?
He confessed to everything.
Really?
And he did so with this really chilling detachment.
Wow.
Showing no remorse whatsoever.
So he was almost proud of what he had done?
It's possible. He might have even seen himself as a kind of artist, creating these grotesque tableaus.
Right.
There's a level of narcissism there that's really hard to grasp.
And then, of course, the police uncover the full extent of his crimes.
Yes.
Human remains in his refrigerator freezer, a vat of acid, skulls, bones, body parts all throughout the apartment.
It was a scene that shocked even the most seasoned investigators.
Yeah.
The apartment was just this testament to his depravity, a literal house of horrors.
Yeah, his trial was a media sensation.
Of course.
Understandably. And he was found guilty of 15 counts of murder.
Right.
And sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms.
Yep.
He was later killed in prison in 1994.
That's right. Beaten to death by a fellow inmate.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive, I think the biggest question that lingers is, what can we learn from this dark chapter in human history?
I think Dahmer's case serves as this chilling reminder that evil can really hide in plain sight. It challenges us to question our assumptions about who's capable of violence.
Right.
And it highlights, I think, the importance of understanding those early warning signs. Even if they seem small or insignificant.
For me, one of the most impactful takeaways is just how much societal factors played a role in Dahmer's life.
Absolutely.
The homophobia of that era, his isolation, the lack of support. I mean, it's hard not to wonder if things could have been different. If he'd had a safe space to kind of explore his feelings and struggles.
I think that's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
We need to create a more inclusive and supportive society that offers people alternatives to the darkness.
Right.
A society where people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
Because ignoring these issues, as we've seen, can have really devastating consequences.
Dahmer's story is a tragedy on so many levels for the victims and their families, for the community that was terrorized by him.
Right.
And for a society that just failed to recognize and address those warning signs.
It's a story that really stays with you.
Yeah.
It forces you to confront some really uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world that we live in. We've covered a lot of complex information today.
We have.
But it leaves me with one final haunting question for our listeners.
Okay.
Could tragedies like this be prevented? And if so, how?
That's a question I think we all need to grapple with, both individually and as a society.
Yeah.
And I think by learning from the past and working to create a more just and compassionate world, we can hopefully prevent future tragedies.
Well, thank you for joining us for this difficult but very important deep dive into the life and crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. We hope this episode has encouraged you to think critically about these issues and to consider how we can all work towards a world where such horrors are less likely to occur.